Hi, this is Paula Gloria, and this show is called Farther Down the Rabbit Hole because we like to go into topics more deeply. I'm coming to you today from Rabbit Hole Central, and I have a special guest, and that's Professor Robert Ashford. And Robert, thank you for joining us.
It's a pleasure to be with you. Thank you so much for the good work you do.
Great. So I just want to give you a little update about why I'm so excited about this show, and that since I'm now doing 58 minutes, you'll have more time to go over your economic understanding of binary economics. And a few days ago, I did a television show with David Casavas. He was running for borough president, about 6 months ago. And while he came on my show to do his campaign, I discovered he knew a lot about co-ops, and this was a situation I was interested in. In other words, that I have shares in a corporation, and the benefit that I get from these shares is that I can live in my apartment in Gramercy Park. Now, a lot of my understanding of what was really going on with the co-ops came from reading Henry George's work, particularly Progress and Poverty. And I've got this book up now. You can't see it, Robert, but you will when the show is up. And this is underwritten by the Robert Schachenbach Foundation. So you get a beautiful hardbound copy from this man that 100 years ago every intellectual knew about, but today you don't. There's another book also called Social Problems. And I know that this would be really close to your heart, Robert, because you told me that one of the motivations for your work with binary economics is the hungry and the homeless. So with that in mind, social justice, you might conduct the show however you want. And then also I had hooked it up with Bob Brichelle, who was one of my guests in the past, and he'd been exposed to Norman Kurland and the Center for Economic and Social Justice in Washington, D.C., to have an idea of how city planning, because he's the director of urban affairs at Rutgers, how city planners need to be supported by a good economic paradigm. So, without further ado, Robert.
Well, I'm so glad to be able to be with you. I did watch the show with Robert Brichelle, and I guess also Carl Pearson was on that show, and I did watch your show with David Casavas, and I was impressed with all three individuals because each one of them, I think, was concerned about the welfare of the common person, the man and woman who have to work for a living, or if they're struggling, they may be on welfare, or they're just trying to make ends meet. But the things, the struggles that all these people face, and I was very impressed with all three gentlemen. I was happy to know that each of them seemed open to new ideas, and I think that's a very important part of making progress. So I think there's a saying that if you keep on doing the same things over and over again, don't expect a different result.
Right.
One of the lessons, I think the broader lessons, is that if we have persistent problems like the problems of poverty, or just the problems of keeping a job, or the problems of getting ahead in the world, then they consistently exist, then maybe there's something fundamentally that we're missing in trying to do something for the ordinary. And binary economics is a new look at economic theory that takes us beyond the ordinary. And I could tell from those conversations, particularly the ones with Robert Brichelle and Carl Pearson, because Norm Kurland, someone who understands binary economics, was also there. I could tell that that there was still a gap in the understanding, the kind of link in the understanding of why it is that we have these economic downturns, and that's what binary economics deals with. One way I start by trying to explain binary economics to people, and is to show that little chart that you have of the two faces. And oftentimes I flash that quickly in front of people and say, what's the first thing you see? And most people see two faces first, because we project the humanistic side of things. And that's statistically proven with the psychological test. But it also could be a vase. And that's an example of seeing something in two fundamentally different ways. And the difficulty with understanding binary economics, although it's a relatively simple subject, it's a little bit like trying to show a diagram like that to a tribe of people that have never had pottery. No matter how smart you are, you're going to see the faces, but you're not going to see the vase. And it takes that imaginative leap. And the other thing about it is that nothing you understand about the organizing construct of the two faces lead you to the vase. You can't look more and more at the faces and see the vase. It's a leap. In binary economics, it's a little bit of a leap. Now, we call it a new paradigm, and the reason you have new paradigms is to explain things that old paradigms don't explain very well. I used to think that the sun went around the earth. That was an illusion. Every day the sun rises, but that's a complete illusion. We finally got it straight, and that set the facts down to the point where we can understand Newton's laws and modern science. We have the same kind of an illusion in economics. And the illusion in economics is the idea that capital makes labor more productive. In a sense, capital does make labor more productive because you can take the output of capital and labor, that is to say people and tools, people and machines, people working with land, and you can say, well, we can take that whole output and divide it by the input of labor. And that's one way of looking at things. But there's another way of looking at it, too, and that leads me to the basic premises of binary economics. And that is that really, when you look at capital, it's doing more and more of the work.
Oh, are we on chart 2?
So let's go to chart 2.
Okay.
If you were to graph economic output from the earliest times, let's say 1700 until today, it would go up. There are statistics from economists Robert Heilbronner, who is a Nobel Prize winner, and Lester Thoreau, who chaired the economics department at MIT, world-famous economists. They estimated that between 1860 and 1980, the output of the United States per capita, so you're adjusting it for population growth, was 6 times as great. We're making 6 times as much today.
Excuse me, Robert, am I on the right chart, figure 3.1?
Yes, you are. Yes,
okay,
you are. So you see a growth.
Because it starts off at 1700, that's why.
Yes, that's correct, and I'm just sort of taking a certain part of that. What you see there is a rising line which represents increasing production.
Okay.
Increasing production over that time. Now, sometimes you have ups and downs, and when you have recessions, you have downs, but it's basically an upgoing line. And
right.
I'm just taking, when I mentioned Mr. Heilbronner and Dr. Thoreau, that if you just look from, let's say, 1860 to 1980, 6 times as much production per person. So you have this immense growth. But are we doing 6 times as much work as then?
Okay, I'm not seeing that it's 6 times in the chart, but I guess I'm assuming that's right. Productive capacity and real production?
Yes. Well, the chart, that's correct. And I don't mean, maybe I'm confusing things. The chart simply is a sketch of growth. It's not a particular numerical notion of growth. So you're right. This line would have to go much further.
Okay.
Match the statistics
okay.
of Heilbronner and Thoreau. So you are absolutely correct. It has to be a much steeper line than what is shown here. But these charts are intended just to illustrate the general principle that we have continuing growth with time.
I see.
Over time.
Okay, so the question you're asking is, are we working harder?
Are we working harder? What's the difference? And the normal think is, well, much more human productivity, but the binary approach is to say that actually land, machines, tools are contributing much more to production. So there are 3 principles in binary economics. The first one is that capital and labor both do work. The second one is that technology makes capital much more productive than labor. And the third one is that the broader distribution distribution of capital ownership will soak up unused capacity profitably and promote growth. Those are three principles, and I'll try to explain them. And one way to explain them is to look at the difference between productivity and productiveness. When Adam Smith looked at the economy, he looked at, let's say, sawing boards, and he would say that you can saw 10 boards an hour with a handsaw, or 100 boards an hour with a machine saw. The capital, that's the saw. The extra technology embedded in the machine saw makes the person 10 times as productive. But the binary economists would say, but actually the person is doing much less work. For each board sawed, the machine is really doing much more of the work. And we explain that in another way, and that is, suppose you haul a sack a mile and you're exhausted, and you put 10 sacks on a horse or a donkey and go twice as far in half the time. Well, the horse is really doing almost all the extra work.
Oh, I should be on the horse chart, right?
And then you would shift to the horse chart. And then if you put 10,000 sacks on a truck and you do 50,000 sack miles worth of work, it's the truck that's doing most of the extra work. So binary economics looks at this notion of what we call productiveness, which means work done, if you look backwards, or it means productive capacity, if you're looking forward. And the growth that we have is not because humans are working harder. It's because the machines, the tools, the technology, reflected in capital instruments, is doing much, much more of the work.
So it seems you want to have the cooperation of the donkey or the machine in order to do the work in a way that benefits you. So you have the benefits of the work.
But you not only need to be able to work with the donkey, you need to be able to own the donkey. Because the owner of capital gets its income. And that's the other element to this.
Okay.
So binary economics just starts with a recognition that capital and labor both do work. And if you were to look at all the things that were produced in, let's say, 1776, think about a movie about the Revolutionary War, and then the War of 1812, and then maybe the Civil War, and then the turn of the last century, around 1900, when little horseless carriages were still just coming in, and then the Depression, and then the 50s and the 70s. If you were to do a sort of a mental look at all the output compared to today, how much more we have today, the difference is capital, not labor. And I mean by capital, I don't mean financial capital. I don't mean money. I mean land, machines, tools, structures, things that are reflected as assets. Capital is doing most of the work, and as a consequence, capital also is earning most of the income, because work is income. So the first recognition, and it's the question of why it is that we are in the state that we are in, is because we are trying to distribute the earning capacity, enough earning capacity to buy what we can produce, but we're trying to do it through jobs and welfare. And you can't do it through jobs and welfare because capital is producing so much more of what we do. So the first premise of binary economics is that capital and labor are each independently productive. And the second premise of binary economics is that technology makes capital much more productive than labor. You could say that technology makes labor more productive, but it makes capital much more productive than labor. So there are 6 things that capital does that contributes to growth. It replaces labor, but it also vastly supplements labor. Anytime you use a capital instrument to do what was once done by labor, you get vastly more productive power. We can't compete with horses for hauling or computers for calculating quickly. All those different things. Capital does work that labor can never do. A farmer never grew an apple. We can't make a single computer chip because our hands are too big. We can guide it to capital.
Hello? Robert? Hello?
So capital has 6 potent contributions to growth. The first thing capital does is it replaces labor, and then it goes on, but it rarely just replaces labor. Anytime you use a capital instrument to do what labor once did, you get vastly more productive power. You can't compete with horses for hauling or calculators for calculating. And so you get vast explosion of productive power. And the third thing capital does is that it does work that labor can never do. And I mentioned that a farmer never grew an apple, and we can't make computer chips. We can't fly. With capital instruments, we can help them do those things, and we go along for the ride, but we can't do them all by ourselves. And capital works without labor. Consider your washing machine, for example, and all the different automations. Those are all the ways that capital contribute to growth. Now, you could say, well, it takes the person to run this thing. That's true, but it takes people to invent capital. It takes people to build it, to install it, to repair it, to monitor it, to operate it, to finance it. But that's not the work of the capital. That's the labor work involved. But you're always doing more with more productive capital and less labor. And so that's the second principle of binary economics. Technology makes capital much more productive than labor. But the third principle, and this is how we begin to help the common man and woman, is that capital has the power to pay for itself out of the promise of its future income. In the business world, you only invest in things that pay for themselves. And the sixth thing that capital can do is it can distribute the income necessary to purchase its output. That is to say, one person's cost is another person's income. So the more broadly capital is acquired with the earnings of capital, the more we will soak up productive capacity that we're not using now, and the more we will promote growth. And the huge problem that we have right now with this depression, this recession, is not the power to produce. Our problem is that we can't distribute the income to make production profitable. People are being laid off, not because producers can't produce more at lower unit costs. People are being laid off and losing their jobs and growing poorer because people can't afford to acquire what we can produce. So the third principle of binary economics says that the promise of broader capital income in the future, that is to say, the promise of capital buying itself, paying for itself, and then distributing income to more people who will use its income on production, will soak up unused capacity and promote growth. The huge anomaly we have today in the economy is that we have the vast ability to produce more, but we can't distribute the earning power necessary to produce it. And that's because capital income is so terribly, terribly concentrated. So the three principles of binary economics speak to the economic situation that we have right now. And this principle that the broader distribution of capital acquisition with the earnings of capital will profitably soak up unused capacity and promote the investment in more capital and labor. That's a principle that very few people understand. Adam Smith didn't understand it. You won't find it in Karl Marx. His solution was to socialize private property, to outlaw the accumulation of capital. You won't find it in the neoclassical economists. You won't find it in John Maynard Keynes. You won't find it in John Kenneth Galbraith or Milton Friedman. None of the people who advise the governments and who advise the think tanks and who set the agenda for Congress recognize that the broader distribution of capital acquisition with the earnings of capital will soak up unused capacity and promote growth. And that's the principle of binary economics that needs to be much more broadly understood. And when I was listening to your interview with Mr. Burchell and Mr. Pearson and Mr. Gustavus. In all instances, although they are each, in a way, trying to solve the problems that they are interested in solving, I would say none of them were aware of this growth potential, and that's because it's not taught widely, it's not widely understood. Now, Norm Kurland does understand this growth potential,
right.
But if you re-listen to your discussion on that TV, on your TV programs, your fine programs, the idea of broader growth coming from the broader distribution of capital acquisition didn't really surface, and it's that missing link that is involved. And then, of course, the question becomes, well, how would you do this?
Right, right.
And first of all, one way you deal with this problem of solving poverty not through jobs and not through welfare, but through capital acquisition, first of all, it helps to recognize a couple of basic sort of political facts that are not normally recognized. And the first one is that the recession that we're having right now, and the depressions we've had, and the sluggish growth that we have, is all the result of not addressing the problem of how to distribute income to people.
Right.
A recession is a recognition by the market that future earning capacity does not exist to buy what we can profitably produce otherwise, if we could sell it, and repay debt. That's the essence of a recession. We have the productive. General Motors can make more cars, but we can make more houses. There's not an industry that's in trouble that we couldn't make more at lower unit costs. So the first recognition is that the lack of the distribution of earning capacity is fundamental. That's precisely the problem of poverty. And in a recession, the poverty oozes up like water, floodwaters, into the middle class. And so that's first of all, you stop by. So what's too big to fail is not Wall Street. What's too big to fail, and what needs prompt attention, is the earning capacity of poor and working people.
Right.
Now, we do address that with jobs and welfare, and the Democrats and the Republicans talk about jobs and welfare, but that's only part of the story. Capital acquisition is the crucial part that's missing, and capital, like horses and trucks, are much more productive. They do much more work than humans, and they can be concentrated or they can be broadly owned. I tell a little joke sometimes about the mouse and the elephant. You know, the mouse and the elephant are friends, and the elephant, and they live in the circus, and every once in a while the elephant gets rambunctious and has to run around, and people have to get out of the way, and they pull up their tents, and they, duck. And the mouse is riding on his head as the elephant is thundering through the circus. And when the elephant is thundering, you know what the mouse is doing? The mouse has got his little hands cupped, and he says, look out, here we come.
I know.
Well, labor is the mouse. And with all the technology and all of the know-how and all the knowledge society and the knowledge workers, labor is still the mouse, and capital is the elephant. And it not only has the capacity to do much more work, but also distribute much more income. So the How to Do It department says, let's focus on an economic right that is important to people. You know, I'm a lawyer, a law teacher, and the highest role of the lawyer is to enable people to identify and secure their essential rights in society and the responsibilities. Here's a right that I think is important. It's the right to acquire capital with the earnings of capital. Now that's the whole thing. It's not just the right to acquire capital. It's the right to acquire capital with the earnings of capital. That is the essence of capitalism. In fact, the whole Cold War was largely about whether the right to acquire capital with the earnings of capital would be preserved in private hands, or whether it would be outlawed. The essence of communism is outlawing the right to acquire capital with the earnings of capital. The essence of communism is not a one-party state, although they had one. You could have had a two-party state or a three-party state. It still outlawed the right to acquire capital with the earnings of capital. That's what put us at nuclear gunpoint against one another. And that's why we're not there today, because the Russians have given up the idea of outlawing the right to acquire capital with the earnings of capital. Now, isn't it interesting that that was driving the Cold War, and probably the only people who understand that right is important are the people who have had exposure to binary economics. You didn't hear Milton Friedman talking about it, or John Kenneth Galbraith talking about it. You won't hear Obama talking about it, and you won't hear McCain talking about it. You won't hear the Democrats, Republicans. You won't hear it on NPR. You won't generally hear it. It's a crucial right, and the capital that buys itself for the rich today buys itself on the promise of its future income, can buy itself even more profitably if poor and working people are cut into the business, cut into that process as well. And that's the magic relationship, natural law relationship that distinguishes binary economics from everything that came before. So let's move on. We're going to...
Increasing capital productiveness?
Yes.
Okay, I've got it.
Now that chart shows, it's intended to show that economic growth is a process, and technological advance is the process of shifting the work from labor to capital, and that's the essence of invention. When we were, Homo habilis, the precursors to humans, was a knowledge worker. They picked up stones and did work with them and scrapes and little things like that. So we're shifting work. So it shows in the beginning on the left that almost all work was done by labor. That's coming from the zero on the top left down, almost all work done by labor. Over time, it shifts. So, pardon me, somewhere along the lines, and we're not sure exactly where we are, most work is done by capital. So the key is to enable people to acquire a share of productiveness. So I'm going to move on from that chart and show you. I'm going to go now. We can probably skip ahead for a minute to the chart that shows the corporation.
Okay, corporation as an independent entity and nexus of contracts?
Yes, that's that one. Now, the corporation is shown in that big center box. And corporations don't have to grow, but typically they grow as society grows. That is to say, we need to produce more as time goes on. There's a limit to growth, and we can talk about that. It's run by a board of directors. It has officers. And it has all these relations. It has relations with customers, employees, buyers, the government. It has stockholders and bondholders. You can see that in the bottom left box there. It relates to banks. It relates to insurance companies. It relates to tort victims. I mean, you may not have a relationship to General Motors until one of their cars hits you, and then you have a relationship with them. But of course, it relates to the environment. And although the environment is a little box, it's actually the whole page. It's everything. We're all immersed in the environment. And corporations are the dominant way of doing business in our society. We produce things primarily through corporations. And if you look at the ownership of corporations, 1% of the people own about 50% of the corporate wealth. 10% own 90% of the corporate wealth. And that leaves 90% of the people scrambling for the rest. And most of those people have negative net worth. And that's the situation we find ourselves in. That's the economic reality. Now, the interesting thing about this is that most corporate capital, meaning say land, machines, tools, structures, I'm not using the word financial capital, that's a different animal, and we'll talk about that. Almost all capital is acquired with the earnings of capital. If you look at America's 3,000 largest companies, they own about 90% of the investable assets in America exclusive of real estate. And they finance their capital acquisition 70% with retained earnings. Those are the earnings after you paid everybody, so those are the earnings of capital. Or borrowed money, which is repaid for out of the earnings of capital, and a little bit with the sale of stock. But most of the people who can afford to buy stock are, again, that 1%. So almost all capital is acquired with the earnings of capital. So if we're going to broaden capital ownership, we can't expect people who don't own capital to acquire it with labor. That's not the way the rich are doing it. That's not the way the upper middle class is doing it. You can't expect it. You might as well expect a person to compete with a horse for hauling. You expect people to acquire capital with the earnings of labor. It's a pre-industrial way of acquiring capital. The real way to acquire capital is with the earnings of capital. And the corporate mechanism is a way of doing that. Some people condemn corporations, think corporations are the problem. Corporations are just a tool. In the wrong hands, corporations can do bad things. In the right hands, they can do good things. And they're a tool, and the reality is that we have to face is that they are the dominant way of doing business in the world, which means the dominant way of producing goods and services. And the magic of binary economics is that it reveals that the more broadly a corporation expands the ownership of its shares, the more profitable it will be. It's in the interest of the corporation to broaden its ownership. People don't understand that, but that is the reality, and we can begin talking about how that is done. So with that, we can skip to the next box, the next chart, which is a little 3-part chart.
Is that on 8? Yeah.
Yes, that would be 8.
Okay, great.
Here you see a corporation.
The general theory diagram.
It's just a part of it. It's 3 little boxes. Now this works in a way, you could conceive of this very much the way a mortgage works. If you could, instead of calling it the corporation or the company, you call that a home. And you call the constituency trust a borrower. You had a lender. A lender lends to a borrower. The borrower buys the home, earns income from perhaps from labor, or whatever, repays the lender, and then after the loan is paid off, the home is owned free and clear. That's acquiring capital with the earnings of labor. But when you have the corporate form, you have the option to use the corporation's earnings itself to pay back the loan. So imagine a corporation that plans growth, meaning to say it believes that some growth will pay for itself out of the promise of its future income. And that happens every day, every year that happens, even during recessions. Some corporations are growing. Not all corporations shrink in a recession. Now, it could finance its growth with retained earnings. It could finance its growth with borrowed money directly from the lender. It could finance its growth with sale of stock. But this binary approach would say, well, here's a new way to do it. We could let a loan go to a trust that would represent, let's say, employees of the company, consumers of the company, neighbors, people who live around the company's plants. Imagine a company that has a installation in the town and is the biggest employer in the town. Neighbors, even welfare recipients could be the beneficiaries of this. So the loan goes to the trust. The trust invests in stock of the company. The company issues the new stock. The company takes the money and makes the investment it would have made anyway. If you assume that, and we'll look at the counter assumption, but if you assume that this investment is good, it will pay for itself in a competitive period, which means the corporation will earn profits from it. It distributes the profits to the trust. The trust repays the loan. And after the loan is repaid free and clear, the constituency trust owns shares in the company for the benefit of employees, consumers, neighbors of the company, and welfare recipients. And now, as the company begins to earn more on that capital, because it will have a rate of return after the payout period, just as it had a rate of return before the payout period, it begins distributing an income to the employees, to consumers, to the neighbors and welfare recipients. And that's the process. That 3-part process is what's envisioned for a corporate mechanism to broaden ownership. Now you might say, what's in it for the corporation, and how can we make it work? Right now, you'll notice that if you loan to the trust is enabled to acquire something that the existing shareholders could have acquired directly. So you could say, why should we cut in the new owners? Why should we cut in new owners when we can have it all ourselves? And the answer to that question is that there's a huge growth potential in cutting in everybody. There's a huge growth potential, just as there's a huge unused capacity in our society. I wish I had started our program with the focus on unused capacity. I usually do that. I didn't do it this time. But if you were the king or the queen of the world today, listeners, and you wanted to feed the world, clothe the world and give people the resources to take themselves to the highest good. It might be impossible to do it all, but I think it'd be a heck of a lot easier than 100 or 200 years ago. That is to say, we have the capacity to do so much that we cannot do because there's no profit in it. But broader ownership will create the profit in it. So what we need to do now is flip to the next chart, which is the 6-box, what's called the general theory diagram. You'll notice it has the 3 boxes we had before, the corporation, the constituency trust, and the commercial lender. But it has 3 other entities. And these 3 other entities exist today, but they're not hooked up to help poor and working people. So let's look at the entities. We've got the corporation, we've got the trust, we've got the lender. Box 4 is what's called a capital credit insurer, a company that insures lenders on their loans. We have capital credit insurance today. Lloyd's of London is a age-old capital credit insurers. You can certainly abuse capital credit insurance by selling more insurance than you can cover, and that AIG is a good example of how it can be abused. But nobody's talking about eliminating private capital credit insurance. We are saving the company, and then we want to regulate it to have it work better, but the concept of capital credit insurance is there, and we have government reinsurance. The government is involved in lots of guaranteed loans.
Is that 5?
For favorite industries.
Government reinsurance, is that 5?
That's 5, yes.
Okay.
And that's an entity, too, that's involved. And we have reinsurance. FHA is reinsurance, and Fannie Mac and Fannie Mae are examples. Now, you can say, well, look, they did terribly. Well, most of their history, they made money, and they helped people buy homes. And when you buy a home, you're not buying an income-producing piece of property. But the same principle of federal reinsurance is applicable here. And finally, you've got the central bank that is in the process of monitoring the money supply. Now, there are those that say, well, how do the rich get richer? The rich get richer. I mean, you can say some of them are geniuses, and some of them are movie stars, and some of them are inventors, and they do. But an awful lot of the rich get richer just by having their capital acquire capital with more capital, having your horses work for you. And every one of these 6 boxes are involved there.
Hang on, just one point I want to ask on this 58 minutes. With the capital reinsurance here that the government, I guess the Fannie Mae and so on, and you said most of the time it was doing well,
yes.
Right? But the problem is it started making loans for people just based on their houses. In other words, it didn't give them an opportunity to get a claim into something that then would produce income that they could pay the loan back. Is that correct?
That is correct. There are 2 or 3 problems with what happened to real estate. One of the problems is that we provided credit insurance to enable people to buy homes, but we didn't extend the principle to enable them to buy a diversified portfolio in America's profitable industries.
Okay. So what I want to say on that is when David Casavas was saying when you're getting a co-op, you're a shareholder, you're a part of a business. But the problem is you don't have any access to any of the revenues that the business is producing. Right. The only thing that you get is the right to live in your apartment, and that's not enough.
That's right. And by the way, I did listen to that carefully. When he says it's a business, he is not saying it's a profit-making manufacturing company. What
Right.
he meant by saying it's a business is that you are limited to the corporate form, and these co-ops are usually nonprofit entities, and that means that your only control is to elect directors who control it, and that they have the power to make decisions for you. And although it's a quote nonprofit entity, it is an entity that takes care of its own business. It's in the nonprofit business of running a co-op. There's a separate issue, and that is to say, should we be in a business and should we be promoting ownership in income-producing property? And the answer is absolutely yes. And one of the problems with the real estate situation is it's a good principle, but not applied where it should first be applied.
Okay, I just wanted to take that deviation to.
Yes, well,
to
we could go into what happened to the housing industry, and there are lots of problems with it. But from 1936, when the FHA was first established, 1/3 of the people owned homes. Today, 2/3 of the people own homes, and every home was paid for, and there was no redistribution. And the FHA made money except for a couple of years at the end of the Reagan administration, where there was actually some criminal activity, and except to recently when we went through this real estate bubble and irresponsible lending. But those irresponsibilities point to the need for regulation. They don't point to destroying the mechanisms that we have here. Nobody's talking about stopping corporations from doing business. Nobody's talking about stopping trustees from acting for investors. Nobody's talking about stopping commercial lenders or stopping commercial capital credit insurance or government reinsurance or the operations of the central bank. All those things are what we're trying to preserve by economic recovery, and we're helping all of those entities, except we're not broadening ownership. And just as these entities right now are used to enable the rich and to acquire capital with the earnings of capital, a few of the poor, a few of the middle class, but mostly the rich, and providing jobs and welfare for everybody else, these institutions can be modified only slightly, only opened up. They're just open what they're doing right now, in which case poor people could expect to participate not only through jobs, not only through welfare if they lose their jobs, but also through capital acquisition with the earnings of capital.
And that's what your
all these things. But we're not doing it for everybody. We're only doing it in ways that help the rich get richer with capital acquisition and the poor struggle for jobs and welfare.
So in other words, your 6 boxes is something that's used only by a very few.
That's right. But basically, 1% of the people derive 50% of the capital ownership through these boxes. 10% derive 90% of the capital ownership, capital acquisition through these boxes, and 90% of the people are basically shut out of this process. So you could say it's a denial of equal protection.
Okay, so could you say, since I know the Henry George people like to talk about monopoly as being a problem, could you say it's a monopoly of knowledge?
Well, it's a monopoly of the right to acquire capital with the earnings of capital. And it's a monopoly of knowledge if these people understand it and are keeping it from people.
Okay.
And one of the things that your statement is really wonderful. Notice that the principle I'm standing on is what's called a fact proposition. It could be true or false, but it's a fact proposition. Either the broader distribution of capital acquisition with the earnings of capital will soak up existing unused capacity profitably and promote growth, or it will not. It's a true or false. It's nothing good or bad. It's true or false. It's a fact proposition.
Well, I think what the Henry Georges say is that if you don't have access to resources, then even if you have 2 eager hands that are willing to create something, because you don't have access to the resources, you can never create, and so the wealth isn't there.
Well, they are saying that, and I think there are others that have said the same proposition. Actually, I'm not an expert on Henry George, but as I understand Henry George, his theory, it is that the incremental value of land is fundamentally a function of population, and that's not a function of anybody's work. Since it's a function of population.
But I think it's because the population has 2 hands. They're not just one hungry mouth. He said every person that comes in isn't just a mouth, it's also 2 hands.
That's true. But there's this growing value in land which nobody's working for.
No, but the growing value is because of the 2 hands. They're creating culture and art, and that's why you want to live in cities, and that's why the cities are more valuable.
Well,
because of people make it more valuable. Well, people are a good thing.
Because of population. Yes,
yeah.
It's because of population. And but again, I don't want to deviate.
Okay.
Wonderful having Henry George
notion
here. But it is true that Henry George's theory conceives of growth as a function of human productivity.
Yes. Yes.
And binary economics says no, human productivity is only a part of growth, and the elephant in growth is not human productivity. The elephant in growth is capital. And that's where the two differ.
Unless you produce a way to own the capital, maybe you produce an idea. There has to be some way to get access to that.
Well, again, the capital that buys it, the horse will haul whether it's owned by a rich man or a poor man.
Okay, fair enough.
And you might say, well, it takes someone has to know how to handle the horse. Yes, but you can pay for that as labor.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
All the work, all the labor it takes to put a capital instrument in place: invention, creation, installation, operating it, repairing it, monitoring it, cleaning it up, finance. All that labor is fine. We need it, but it's not the work of the capital. You wouldn't do that labor if the work of the capital weren't a plus on top of that, and a big plus. So there is a fundamental notion. Henry George, we can get into the technical, and I don't want to. I feel like
I know you only have 10 minutes left.
But its view of growth is fundamentally the issue of allocation of resources and supply demand. It's a different theory of growth. It's true. I think Henry George's theory is true. I just don't think, in and of itself, it will enable people to acquire capital with the earnings of capital, and I think capital ownership is the only thing that really liberates people.
Great. So for the last 10 minutes, how do we get liberated?
Well, I think the next proposition here is to without going into further into the six-box diagram temporarily, I think that within the last 10 minutes, let's assume this for a minute, that we had an economy that enabled people to participate in this capital acquisition through these six boxes. So they had the same advantages as the 1%. And corporations could broaden ownership as much as just as they're able to concentrate ownership. So they got the option to do it. Let's assume that, just for a minute, that X% of America's 3,000 largest companies finance Y% of the new acquisition. So it's only a part of that hatched box on top of the corporation. Okay. In this way, and if you assume further that it takes the capital 7 years to pay for itself, then in the 8th year, 1 year's worth of capital will have paid for itself for these acquisitions. So this assumes that X% of the companies in America voluntarily finance Y% of their capital acquisition in this way, and that net of business failures, which is paid for by the capital credit insurance, net of the business failures, there is a 7-year capital cost recovery period. In year 8, 1 year's worth of capital is paid for itself. So that annual acquisition, which is represented fully paid for stock in year 8, now has a rate of return, which is going to employees, consumers of the company's products, neighbors of the company's plants, and even welfare recipients. In year 9, a second year's worth of capital is paid for itself. So there'd be twice as much capital income distributed in year 9, if assuming just a constant amount. In year 10, 3 years' worth of capital is paid for itself. In year 14, 7 years of capital acquisition will have paid for themselves. Half the annual acquisitions will have paid for themselves. And as you move on, more and more of the capital, a higher percentage of the capital acquisitions will have paid for themselves and are now generating income for people. So incremental productive capacity in the form of capital ownership is linked, after a 7-year gap, to incremental productive capacity, incremental earning capacity. You're distributing earning increasingly through broader ownership. Now, corporations looking at this, and corporations have 3, 5, and 7-year capital investment plans, when they see more consumer demand in years 8, 9, and 10, 7, 8, 9, and 10 and on, corporations that are producing and existing in year 4 or 5, if they have a 3-year capital investment horizon, they're going to need to build new plants. They're going to begin to have to plan up for growth. Every corporation has some unused capacity, which is just kind of a cushion. But they begin, when they see more markets, they begin using that unused capacity, and they invest in more capacity. So a company that has a 3-year capital investment horizon, and let's say in year 5, is going to begin revving up, and it has suppliers, and those people are going to see that they've got to begin producing more, and the suppliers have suppliers. This is a process that telegraphs all the way to the beginning. So you have an incentive by this growing mountain of earning capacity distributed to poor and working people, which is the promise of greater income, greater demand in the future, which provides the incentive for the employment of more capacity in the present.
So
the
you're
employment of more capacity in the present is reflected in capital investment, in hiring people to build, make, install, etc.
So you're creating wealth because you're including more and more people.
That's right. It's the third principle. The more broadly capital is acquired with the earnings of capital, the more you will profitably soak up unused capacity and promote growth. It's just a single principle. We could have probably cut this whole interview saying that principle. The more broadly capital is acquired with the earnings of capital, the more you will soak up unused capacity and promote growth. It's just a simple principle, and that corporations will flourish, and from that process. Now, as welfare recipients in year 8, 9, and 10 begin earning income from capital, you can begin spinning them off welfare and give the corporations whose shares produce that welfare tax benefits. So you can begin basically spinning people off welfare and beginning to reduce taxes. In company towns where people have more income, there'll be more prosperous towns. You might even be able to reduce the tax rates in those towns. It's a way of hooking people up with capital. Now, you can say, well, isn't this a wild theory? Who agrees with it? Let me give you a scientific principle. We have Adam Smith's economics, Karl Marx's economics, Ricardo's economics, neoclassical economics, Keynesian economics, Friedman's, all these people. They all disagree about many things, and all the Nobel Prizes. But you know the one thing they agree on? They all agree that the broader distribution of capital acquisition with the earnings of capital will not promote growth. If they had thought that was true, they'd say so. None of them ever said so. The scientist does when he has 6 or 7 theories that have not solved the problem. And I think the problem is pervasive poverty, middle class struggling, recessions, fear of losing a job, getting old and not having enough to live on. When you have 7 theories that fail to solve a problem, what a scientist does is find out what they agree about and reverse that assumption.
Yeah.
And that's what binary economics does. And so if I could have talked to the 3 wonderful gentlemen, each of whom in urban planning and in the task bank that Carl Person's involved in, and David Casavas, who's concerned about how people are alienated from private property in New York, if I could explain to all of them this, I'd say, add this to your thinking and see where it takes you.
Yeah.
And that's what I'd like to do. And I'd also love to go to the Schachenberg Foundation and explain it to those people as well, because I think George's theories are correct. My only problem with it is I think that it's not the elephant. It helps you get a little bit access to a nicer place on the elephant, maybe, but it's not the elephant. The elephant is capital.
You know, I think, though, there's a lot of nuance here, and I think the important thing is that we strike out in a direction where we can keep the dialogue open, so that people, you know, can discuss these things. For example, the little mouse that's sitting on top of the elephant. Now, there's quite a, you can laugh and you say, get out of the way, here we come. But if in truth that little mouse had the reins to that elephant, then the real question is, how can you what's the knowledge? How do you get the reins?
I think the knowledge is understanding this principle. By the way, you might want to put up as a real quick last chart
Yes.
That little chart, that little color chart that I did with all the different lines going up, 401 we called it.
Yes. Okay, it's up. I have it up.
We can finish up there. First of all these lines go up, but if you notice the little box I put in top, when you have recessions, you get a dip, and so these are just kind of straightened out lines. But what we have here is GNP, basically, in a growing economy, is moving up, and that's the top block line. How GNP means somebody's buying something. You have to have a cash register sale for GNP. We've got capital and wage income. That's the green line. These are just drawn. They're not statistically significant, but they're just. You've got that. You've got government spending, which adds more to that helps close cash register. You've got welfare redistribution. That helps people buy things even though they didn't earn. And the rest of it is financed with consumer credit. Consumer credit enables people to buy what they cannot afford. Capital credit enables people to acquire capital, and therefore, after it's paid for itself, they can afford things on their own income. So it's shifting access to credit from the consumer side, which is crazy, living on consumer credit, to the capital investment side. Now, you can't phase out consumer credit overnight, but you sure can phase it out gradually as you extend more and more capital credit. We shouldn't need consumer credit. People should have the earning capacity from their capital ownership to acquire what they want and need and desire without having to go into hock.
Thank you, Robert. That really says it all.
Distribution of ownership is key, and it's not taking from anybody. It's enabling people to acquire it just the way the rich do. Does that help us?
Thank you, Robert. I really appreciate it. And let's put this out and see the feedback, and I hope to work with you more.
Well, you are terrific to do this, and you're performing a wonderful public service.
Okay.
Take care. Thank you.
Okay, bye. So, hopefully we'll hear from Robert Ashford in the future, and to see if this can be theoretical knowledge that can be applied in a practical way. That depends upon you, the viewers, to give feedback so that we can develop this dialogue. Thank you very much. This is Paula Gloria, and this has been an episode of Farther Down the Rabbit Hole, coming to you from Rabbit Hole Central here in Gramercy Park, New York City.
As welfare recipients in year 8, 9, and 10 begin earning income from capital, you can begin spinning them off welfare and give the corporations whose shares produce that welfare tax